and he was the keynote. And I asked him a question about Scottish studies and the government's push to kind of broaden the curriculum that students are being exposed to. And one of the things he said was just what Michael said, that after a while you start to think this must be deliberate, and so a corrective is usually a good idea. One other point I would add about the gap between William Wallace and the Jacobites and the Industrial Revolution is I vividly remember a lecture when I was at University of Strathclyde in which the professor, a gentleman named John Young, was giving a lecture on the British Civil Wars, Oliver Cromwell and everything else. And he made a point that right before the wars broke out, there was a rebellion by the Scots against King Charles over the Book of Common Prayer. And the Scots not only were massively outnumbered and poorly equipped, they not only won, they succeeded to win another 3 or 4 times, at which point they basically had the king over a barrel and he had to give in to all of their demands. And this just sounded so different from the narrative that I'd been given about, how Scotland developed over time, that it just stuck with me for as long as I can remember. And it really sparked my interest in that period in the 17th and 18th century. And for me, at least, I just think that knowing about these things, wherever you think of them, wherever you stand on the scale, I think knowing about this stuff, knowing about your history is crucial, because you're going to pass by a place that may have been a famous battlefield when you're out hill walking somewhere north of Stirling, and you never know it because there's no plaques, there's no statues. And these things, I think, are important, not just to a people as a nation, but just in general for your education about where you are and what sort of environment you're interacting with as you grow up.
Yeah, because one of the sort of arguments you sort of hear to counter my opening gambit about the historical nature of the current constitutional argument is actually that one of the notes I think you get struck quite a lot by people who are in favour of staying in the Union is look at all of our common history.
Right.
And of course, which I think is an interesting idea because we have common history with everybody that we have any sort of relationship with. We have common history with Germany or with France, but that doesn't sort of entail a particular, it doesn't entail a particular constitutional solution.
There's the Old Alliance pub in Paris. That's a good solution if you're ever there.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, Andrew, because I don't think Britishness. I mean, I'm not one of these people who thinks that Scottish independence, as much as I support it and have since I was in college and university, I don't think of Scottish independence as ending Britishness or some kind of strike against Britishness, because something that happens to me a lot is, I talk about, to my American friends, I talk about things that the Brits are distinct for, and then also things that the Scots are. So, for example, my enduring love of a cup of tea. Some of my American friends still don't understand that, but I always describe it as a British thing. And this is all to say that I think there is something to that. There is clearly a common history on these isles, on the British Isles, that is always going to be something that we talk about at a sort of extra national, a sort of above the level of Scotland, England, Ireland. An example might be the wars against Napoleon, when Napoleon was considering invading the British Isles. I mean, that would have had consequences for all of us. Obviously, World War II and that whole context. So, shared experiences are part of history too. It's just, I think one of the complaints with this whole idea of skewing, or at least what we get taught in schools, is the level to which it is skewed. The level to which high school kids in Scotland know who Oliver Cromwell is, or they know who someone like Winston Churchill is, but they may never have heard of the Duke of Queensberry, who was responsible for the Union, or some other major figure.
And it's interesting about what those gaps might do, I think, about what it is to be somebody who doesn't have a kind of consciousness of history. So you might as well not have history, I suppose. It's and what that does to how you think about politics. Michael?
Just on the history of it, strangely enough, I downloaded an audio book this week with the Andrew Lang History of Scotland, and it's a kind of history that you don't find anymore. It's quite dry, a long list of dates and dates of treaties, and then there was this king, and then he died, and then there was this thing, and then there was that, and it was very dry in that way. But it shows you how this is not a new thing, because there was a little part in it where he said that the first claim of right over Scotland from an English king was in 945. But here's what happened. It was a mistranslation, because the king of Scotland was described as a fellow worker in Old Anglo-Saxon. I believe the word was midwerta. And then two centuries later, another king, again, you have to wonder if this is deliberate, mistranslated it in Latin as fidelis, which is one who gives fealty. So then the legal status of this has been going on for 1,000 years on how this is to be interpreted. And then it comes back to the original point about law. People tend to interpret it however the hell they want, and it might not bear any semblance to the reality. Sorry, just wanted to get that in.
Well, it's a classic legal thing. Craig?
I think that's great, Michael, because as I said to you earlier in the week, this is the sort of thing that people were debating right before the Union of the Crowns, when James the Sixth of Scotland became James the First of England. Like, this sort of stuff was constantly talked about because, who owes allegiance to who? Can a king who is, technically subservient to the throne of England assume the throne of England? And then again in the Union, there was arguments about, well, technically, you had Daniel Defoe and other English pamphleteers saying, well, actually, England's always had this claim over Scotland, so the Union's just making it formal. It's just fascinating. This is something I love, is that we forget sometimes that we're not the only people who are reading historical documents. Like, people in history that we talk about as historical actors are doing the same thing. They may have had a less rigorous sense of it than we do. But
there's also...
I was just going to add one last point there. I'm just sorry. That despite all the conversations about history and being a historian, I think your first question, Andrew, about the skepticism, about the importance of it, I think that's fair. And I think knowing the history matters, but you can't let it drive you, because history is about understanding the past and where we came from, but it doesn't have to dictate where we go. I think going forward is something you can shape by bringing in a range of other perspectives: economics, politics, sociology, all other types of disciplinary fields, law, for example, that really can help you shape a path. And you can learn from history, as the traditional thing goes, but it generally doesn't have to drive you.
Yeah.
I always think that one of the points I very firmly believe is that you needn't believe that the Union in 1707 was right or wrong in order to favour Scottish independence now. I'm always befuddled by people that seem to find that, sort of bought and sold for English gold story. They still get so much emotional juice out of it, whereas I can't really see it as relevant, I suppose, to the choice that we're making in 2014.
I also find that, the things with historical claims of right, sorry, this is going back a little bit, but, a lot of these things were simply made up. Right, I'm the king of this place, so I decide that I'm the king of this place unilaterally, and that's it, because I said so. Like, these claims are made and then ignored. It actually strikes me more in the kind of modern, in the more modern sense after the Industrial Revolution, to go back to school history, how people just kind of got a few lawyers and divided up the commons. And this kind of feudal king thing before, just saying, right, well, I claim right to that under God because I say so. It's an older version of, what happened in the kind of Industrial Revolution with capitalists dividing up the land and getting rid of the commons. And again, I agree with Craig. It's how much attention do you have to pay to it? Only how much it dictates the current reality. And maybe the division of the commons has a bit more to do with current reality than what some possibly mad genocidal king said in the 10th century.
Yeah, I suppose this is interesting too about something else which I've noticed, which is quite confusing to me, as with my kind of legalistic hat on, is how there's a kind of lively and very specific sort of legal consciousness among particular Scottish nationalists, which is very historical, which would begin citing things at you like, the claim of right and so on. When you read the claim of right, you're really struck by it's mostly not what it says about contemporary debates about the rights of Scottish institutions, but it's rabid anti-Catholicism, frankly.
Right. I mean, this is a favourite meme of mine, is that a considerable portion of the period in question, the famous, 16, from about the Glorious Revolution and the Claim of Right to, pretty much the Jacobite rebellions in the 1740s, rabid anti-Catholicism might be the one thing that is truly unifying about Scotland, because from the days of the Reformation, the Scots were always much more, the phrase in history is anti-popish, to the extent that they rejected bishops, they rejected all kind of papal temporal authority.
Sorry, just to interrupt, but to go from historical to popish, that's brilliantly topical. Sorry.
Right, thank you. So basically this week the news would have driven them crazy. But there's no doubt that these guys were, the context in which they're writing is so different, and people pick and choose. It's the same with like political snippets these days. I mean, you opened, Andrew, by talking about how certain things have been picked up from an otherwise pretty dry and pretty sensible report. And it's the same with historical evidence. People look into things and read them to suit their own agenda. And that's something that, one thing I'll say about, training as a historian, and I've had some pretty great training, or at least some pretty great people training me, whether it's worked or not, I'm not sure. But the one thing they impress upon you is you should always, always, always resist the temptation to use historical evidence to push a particular agenda. And just to give an example of that, I find myself, I'm a nationalist. I'm inclined towards the idea of Scottish independence, but I find myself more and more believing the idea that empire was the determinative factor in the union. There was a political, a sort of realpolitik attitude at stake here, at least amongst the educated classes. And so, rather than sort of debunking the narrative as I may have set out in my greener years to do, I find myself more and more asking questions of it. How far does it actually go? It may actually go further than has previously been suggested.
And actually, maybe that's a nice segue when we're talking about the attitudes of the wealthy Scots as compared to those of other Scots, because another one of the stories this week was a poll conducted by Ipsos Mori about independence, and it was a rather interesting poll because unlike the Angus Reid ones, they're very full and complete. It included a question on independence, questions about whether people had favourable or unfavourable views about Alex Salmond, Sturgeon, all of the other leaders, Alistair Darling as well. And as usual, we saw some features. There was a gender gap of about 11%, and the most affluent Scots are still 58% of them opposed to independence, as opposed to 28% who are in favour of it, compared to 39% of poorer Scots, or the poorest Scots, I should say, who are in favour of independence, with 44 against. But one of the funny things about this poll was that they asked about Nicola Sturgeon, what people think about her. And she's been really, I think, pushed to the forefront of this independence campaign by the SNP. And they found that she's got terrifically positive ratings, actually. She got 50% positive ratings, and particularly positive ratings among people who vote for the Labour Party, for the Liberal Party, compared to Alex Salmond, who was much more disliked. I don't know if, Michael, if you've been following any of these polls in any detail at all, but I wonder what you think about Nicola Sturgeon and her visibility. Is it the year of the Sturgeon, do you think?
It's interesting. I think she's done rather well. The blog's quite interesting. It'd be interesting to know if she actually writes it. But, sorry for being a dreadful cynic there, but
That's a fair point.
But yeah, the blog's good. It's funny that you say that the polls coming up with the results that she's becoming quite popular. And recently, have you not noticed that in First Minister's questions, they've kind of been switching the focus of the attack a bit from Salmond to Sturgeon as well? Right. I don't know if you'd noticed that.
No, that's true. Joanne Lamont's been kind of having a go at her background when she was health minister in particular, and suggesting that sort of various problems that she's identified were all Nicola Sturgeon's fault. I wonder, though, what you think about, Craig, about this sort of gap between the most affluent Scots' constitutional attitudes and the poorest Scots' attitudes. What do you make of that?
Not particularly surprised by that finding. I think, the people who have the most to lose from any changes in the status quo, and I think that's been true historically. But also, I think that one of the big things that I'm exercised by in terms of what I think will be decisive in securing a yes vote is the state of the economy. And I think I speak from personal experience here. As a young person growing up in Scotland, graduating with a university degree, and stepping out into the kind of bleak job or sort of work environment that I was greeted with, and this was back in 2009. And I understand it's actually worse now. It's the young people who are disproportionately bearing the brunt of the recession and all of the kind of economic policies that are being brought about by the Westminster government, by the coalition government in Westminster. And so it doesn't necessarily surprise me that they would be more open to change. It seems to me, I have a narrative in my head that I think the sort of Blair, actually going back to Thatcher, Blair sort of coalition narrative was always to protect homeowners and people who had houses to resist any sort of fluctuations in the housing market in order to shore up those people, A, because they're likelier voters than the poorer people, than people in the poorer classes of society, and B, because those people are more inclined to support you monetarily and also, in terms of like being active kind of social reformers. Forget all that. The main point for me was that it seems to me that younger people are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the sort of difficult economic environment right now, and I would assume that would make them more open to change in the status quo.
What do you think about